So, you wouldn't know it from reading the news, but there's currently a giant military buildup happening between China and a multinational coalition led by the United States in the South China Sea. This has been building up for a while. Just a few days ago, the Chinese military fired 4 ballistic missiles into waters near US positions. At least one of these missiles actually missed its target and landed on some villages in Guangxi. Thankfully, it appears nobody was hurt. But the Chinese military has also unveiled a new fleet of destroyers. They've deployed nuclear-armed submarines and fighter bombers. Taiwan has deployed its military to the Pratas Islands, and now India is deploying its navy fleet, which is happening amid an ongoing standoff along the Indian-Chinese border where at least 21 people have been killed. So, how did we get here? What's been the build-up to this military standoff? What has led to it, and what's likely to happen next? So, I'll quickly go into the history of the South China Sea. For most of the history up until the second half of the 20th century, the South China Sea was just a bunch of boring, uninhabitable islands, which nobody thought very much about. For a long time, Taiwan, Japan, China all just fished in these islands amongst themselves. But after the first Sino-Japanese War in the late 19th century, Japan acquired Taiwan from China and most of these islands. Then, during the Chinese Civil War, after Japan was defeated by the United States, Japan relinquished control over these islands, and the Chinese nationalists, the KMT, claimed control over the whole region, except for Okinawa, because they feared it would be used by Japan to invade China again. And so the nationalists created this zone, defensive region called the 11-dash line. Just a few years later, the communists, led by Chairman Mao, they took over China, and the nationalists fled to Taiwan, and so the communists claimed the exact same region, except they removed the Gulf of Tonkin region, and so it became the 9-dash line. And so to this day, officially both Taiwan and China claim the region as theirs. It's just that Taiwan doesn't really do anything about it, whereas China does, but we'll get into that later. In the 1950s, when the US was occupying Japan, they intervened and gave them sovereignty over the Ryukyu Islands, and the Senkaku Islands was then made part of the official prefecture of Okinawa a few years later. None of this at the time was especially controversial, and so why does China now want to take control of the South China Sea, and why is the US there to intervene? There's 3 main reasons for this military buildup. It's resources, number 1, military strategy, number 2, and finally political ideology, which I think is the most important. Because in the 1970s, oil was found near the Senkakus, and China then declared sovereignty over all of them, surely by pure coincidence. And just a few years later, China invaded the Paracel Islands, which at the time was part of South Vietnam, and used it to build a series of oil fields. And for about a decade, things were pretty quiet until China attacked Vietnam again. This time it was northern Vietnam, which had been the victors in the Vietnamese War, and they took control over the Spratly Islands in a conflict which killed 74 Vietnamese sailors. This came about 9 years after China had actually invaded Vietnam, and then lost, but declared victory anyway, as they like to do. And it's because of these military attacks, which is the reason that Vietnam hates China more than any country on earth. So, in the 1980s, UNESCO, part of the United Nations, outlined the laws of the sea, where they declared that nations have territorial waters 100 miles from their shores, and anything beyond that is international waters, which is open to anyone who wants to fish there. But at the same time, in the 80s you had these emerging Asian economies like Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong and Singapore. And so you had massive amounts of trade occurring from Asia to the West. And so the South China Sea region became one of the most valuable regions in the world because of the amount of trade that passes through it. So you can see that if China were to get into a military conflict, another power nearby could potentially cut off that trade route and create an embargo. And so you can see that from a military perspective, you clearly want to be able to secure that trade route. And so in 1992, China formally declared the entirety of the South China Sea region as its own, more than every other nation put together, and presented this hitherto undiscovered map, which is supposed to show that it had been part of China since the Shah dynasty, nearly 5,000 years ago. It's pretty remarkable considering this would put it as one of the oldest maps in existence, and for some reason no historians outside China have ever been allowed to verify it. So pretty amazing archaeological finds from China. In my opinion, the much more important reason is because of Taiwan. Because in 1996, Taiwan had its first democratic elections, and in response to this, China had a huge military build-up. They bombarded the sea near Taiwan with missiles, which forced the US Navy to actually intervene on Taiwan's behalf and surround it, which eventually forced the Chinese Navy to back off, and they forced them to admit they couldn't actually do anything to stop Taiwan. And ever since then, the South China Sea was actually pretty quiet, not a whole lot happened. That was the end of these military incursions, but in the 2010s, Xi Jinping came into power. And there's a bit of a military build-up before Xi Jinping, so you can't entirely lay the blame on him. But the Xi Jinping coming to power is at least concurrent with this new strategy. So, in 2012, China completely annexed the Scarborough Shoal Islands from the Philippines, which was part of the Philippines' fishing waters. The UN mandated a withdrawal, which both sides agreed to, except only the Philippines followed through. The Chinese Navy just stayed behind and has occupied the island ever since. In response to this, Japan legally purchased the Senkaku Islands from its private owner, which triggered massive anti-Japanese riots all across China, which saw Japanese businesses and cars burned, massive anti-Japanese protests. Just a few years after this, China engaged in this new militarization campaign with the Spratlys and the Paracels. They started building these artificial islands, landing bomber planes, creating airstrips and putting missiles on these artificial islands in 2017. So effectively creating this whole militarized zone which China effectively controls, and no one else is allowed to fish there. And they further expanded this in 2019. They engage in this kind of hybrid warfare, so they use militarized survey ships, militarized fishing vessels to purposefully collide with ships, and started doing this in territory near Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and all effectively making sure that these countries can't fish there. Indonesia built a military port in response to these excursions, and since then many Indonesian workers have been turning up dead on Chinese ships, because that's the way they do diplomacy. And so this has been the build-up, this current round of military build-ups, which is the biggest military build-up since 1996. They've been trying to take control of the whole area, and the strategy they've been using is, instead of just invading places, take a little bit of territory, they take a little bit of more territory and a little bit more, and they've been trying to push this forward until they take control of the entire region. And they've actually been quite successful in doing it. And so it's because of these excursions that you've had the US has intervened and held these massive multinational naval exercises joint with the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Australia, India, Japan, Indonesia and Taiwan, all of which have filed arbitration acts and most of them openly rejected China's claims. And this is completely necessary because if something like this doesn't happen, if there's not this strong multinational alliance, China will keep on doing what it's been doing, which is to annex territory from other countries and just refuse to negotiate until it eventually takes control of the entire area. And so why does China do this? Well, you have to remember that dictatorships are very paranoid, and from their perspective, it's every other country is constantly trying to exploit them and overturn them and spread subversion, so it needs to strike first. And we've also seen in many other cases the CCP doesn't actually have full control of its military because of its structure. We've seen cases where the military has been funding mercenaries in Myanmar, killings in India was orchestrated apparently just by a PLA general devising this plan himself. So a lot of this is just the case of individual generals deciding to lead these attacks. But more importantly, the whole ideology of China is that it needs to take back Taiwan. Xi Jinping has said that openly that he will make sure that Taiwan is unified with the mainland before he leaves office. He thinks this will happen within the next 10 or 20 years. He used to talk about doing this peacefully, but he's dropped that part from his speeches for quite a while now.
保留采取一切必要措施的选项，针对的是
Because you've got to realize that every argument the CCP makes for why its rule is good is completely destroyed by Taiwan. I mean, you say, oh, Chinese culture doesn't like liberalism, Chinese culture doesn't like freedom. Well, they like it just fine in Taiwan. Or they claim that the CCP rule was absolutely necessary to create China, to make China prosperous today. Well, Taiwan is much more prosperous. People in Taiwan live much better lives and they didn't need the CCP. And so it may be that because of all this, the coronavirus, you've had this massive pushback against China, that Xi Jinping has decided this is a good time to accelerate this plan. It might be that they want to punish Taiwan for seeking close relations with the US, or it might be this is simply a way to distract from domestic tensions. Because if you've got plots against Xi Jinping, it's better if you can just send all these generals off to India or off to the South China Sea so that they're not plotting in Beijing. And so I think whatever happens, if you look back in history, you can see many other dictators who came to power promising their intent to take territory. When Hitler came to power in Germany, he already had a book called Mein Kampf, which declared his intent to take back the German heartlands and to enslave much of Eastern Europe. But nobody believed him until he actually did it. People didn't take him seriously. Similarly, with the Soviet Union, you had them declaring that their form of communism would dominate the world. And when Cuba became communist, you had this US, United States dithering where they said, oh, we're not going to accept it, but didn't actually do anything. And this convinced the Soviets that actually, if we just place missiles in Cuba, the US are not actually going to do anything. They talk big, but they're not going to follow through. And so because of this, if you allow them to annex territory and keep doing it, that incentivizes them to keep on doing it. Whereas if you say you're going to be met with a massive military response, which they will lose, then they'll back down. And so I think when China openly declares its intent to take back Taiwan and invade it, then we should take them seriously. And so when people pretend that it's the US or Western countries that are making things worse or escalating things in the region, no, China is the one that's annexing and taking territory. China is the one launching these attacks. And what's much more likely to result in a war is a weak response rather than a strong one. So, thank you for listening.